Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming at 9 in the morning, too. First off, I wanted to thank Dennis McKenna for inviting me, as well as all the other sponsors who have made this happen. I also want to thank Anton, as well as Rory and Annette and the Tyringham staff. This is just such a marvelous place to have a conference like this, so thank you for making this happen, all of you. I also wanted to dedicate this to what I call peyote-wise people who have gone on to the other world. Since I started this research, many of our elders have passed on and some not so old, so I dedicated to them, and also to the pioneering women who also contribute to our understanding of entheogens and the human experience. So I first began my field work among the Huichol Indians in 1976, and it was such an amazing experience that I've been going back ever since. I first, when I was doing my doctoral research, I ended up living in the community of San Andres Guamiata in the Huichol Sierras. I lived with a Huichol family. And my dissertation work was really trying to understand the role of women in Huichol culture and in Huichol society. So I thought the best way to get to that information was to learn something that all Huichol women are supposed to learn, and that's backstrap loom weaving, which is a really ancient art form in and of itself. And my mentor, Johannes Wilbert, who is also the mentor of Peter First and Barbara Meyerhoff, was the one who kind of sent me out there to study weaving. And I lived with a family, and I learned backstrap loom weaving, and I lived there for a total of 3 years. And you can't be doing weaving all the time. And they have their lives, they have their other activities, including ceremonial. And so the family that I lived with had a very high position in one of the temples. And that the responsibilities change every 5 years, but they continued to be getting what we call cargo. So I got to tag along with them and go to these ceremonies, and then the ceremonies they had in the house. And of course, peyote was inevitably involved, so I had a chance to go on the pilgrimage to Wirikuta. And our research, my husband Jim is a botanist, and it continues to this day. The way that I became in touch with the Native American churches after I had completed my PhD at UCLA, the first tenure track position that I got was in South Texas, at the University of Texas Pan American. And didn't know at the time, but 2 hours away are the peyote gardens. And it's one of the only places in all of the United States where peyote grows. So I said, okay, this is an omen. I need to find out what happens here on the US side of the border, because I've gone on the pilgrimage. Jim and I have gone various times since then, and various peyote ceremonies we've been involved, but I didn't know what happened in the United States. So I started hanging out with peyote dealers. They're actually local Mexican Americans who live along the Rio Grande River, and they are federally licensed by the US government to legally sell peyote to members of the Native American Church. So I started hanging out with the dealers, and one of them said, you must meet this woman, Amada Cardenas. She's the first federally licensed peyote dealer that in the history of this profession. So I did meet her, and one thing led to another, and we became very good friends, like she does with anybody who shows up at her house. And I hope that Jerry will talk more about that. And so I got to learn what goes on in the Native American Church, but really the focus was on Amada, and I had an opportunity at her house. People from various tribes and churches would come, and this is like the gardens. This is where you go to pray, you go to harvest, if you can, if anything, to buy your medicine. And she allowed people to set up their TBs and run meetings on her property. So I've been to more than 24 meetings, but only on her property. So this is kind of a combination from all of these experiences in how I am approaching this talk today. So close to 50 years ago, when the first ESPD conference ignited a multidisciplinary quest to explore psychoactive drugs, American anthropologists Peter T. First and Barbara Meyerhoff in 1968 participated and documented the pilgrimage led by Ramon Medina, a Huichol shaman apprentice, and they went to Wirikuta, which is the Peyote Desert of San Luis Potosí. So they traveled with a small group of Huichol Indians on the pilgrimage to, as Huichols say, they're hunting the peyote, but they also, what they do is harvest and consume it there, and they also will bring back a supply that they will take up to the Sierras, because it's about 300 miles away from where they live when they go on this pilgrimage. And as a result, Peter First had made the documentary film To Find Our Life, the peyote hunt of the Huichols of Mexico, and Barbara Meyerhoff wrote her ethnographic book, Peyote Hunt, The Sacred Journey of the Huichol Indians. Any of you heard of the movies or the book? Yeah. Growing up in the field of anthropology when in the 70s, that was sort of like a required reading, and they would show the film too. So you fast forward to 1987, and that's when I accompanied a Huichol temple group into the peyote pilgrimage to Wirikuta. And when I went, I had become very good friends with a number of the Huichols, and they allowed me to take photographs, and they were very welcoming to me because they liked the fact I was learning how to weave. And so one Huichol, though, after the pilgrimage, and I had taken pictures, and I had come back with the pictures to give out to everybody, and he was very agitated. And he said to me, "You people, you go on the pilgrimage and you take these photographs, but you don't ask why to the peyote. And I want to tell you, peyote is everything. It is the crossing of the souls. It is everything that is. Without peyote, nothing would exist." So I appreciate that he gave me that reprimand, and it just challenged me to learn anything and everything I could about peyote. So in 1992, I believe, there was this conference that was in San Luis Potosí that Manolo and Donna Torres helped organize on plant shamanism and states of consciousness. So that's when I first presented. I started to put together information that I had been learning about peyote. And I thought, okay, I've learned enough, and now I keep learning more and more. So I hope you'll see as I go through this that there's still so much more for me to learn, and I think for all of us to know about peyote. I just wanted to point out to you where the peyote, the native habitat, is for the peyote. It is a very harsh landscape. It's desert. It's thorny brush, and it's small, tenacious trees. It does vary depending upon where you are in this region. Here's where South Texas is. I lived in McAllen. Rio Grande City is where most of the dealers lived. There are very few now that are even in the profession. Amada Cardenas lived in Miranda City. And so this is the general area where most of the members of the Native American Church go to get their peyote. And then it consists of this Tamaulipan brush scrub deserty area, as well as the whole Chihuahuan desert area. There's a part of West Texas here, and I want to point out Shumla Caves, which I'll talk about in a moment, that goes down into Coahuila and through Mexico to San Luis Potosí, and this is where Wirikuta is. So this whole area is the only place that is the native habitat of the peyote. And I want to thank my husband, Jim, for making this map, because I think it's really beautiful. And yet, if you look at where the Huichols live, they live up in the Sierra Madre Occidental, predominantly in the state of Jalisco, also bordering into Nayarit, Durango, and Zacatecas. And they take this arduous journey to Wirikuta. And before they used to do it on foot, it would take at least 40 days to get there and 40 days back. And they do intensive fasting, no water for most of the day, no salt. They are not allowed to have sex. They also confess. There's a confession cord, and each one has to talk of who they've had affairs with, and they tie knots and cleanse you and throw it into the fire. And that they don't bathe for the whole time either. But nowadays, because of modernization, there are roads. Huichols they'll contract with trucks to take groups down, and they make it in a much shorter period of time. So we don't really know who were the first people to have started to use peyote, to recognize it. The oldest dates that we have that have been mentioned in a couple of these other talks come from ancient sites from Coahuila, Mexico to Lower Pecos region in Texas. In one rock shelter, there was peyote that was dried, and it was beaded on a fiber cord, and it was left in this shelter. Peyote has been also found in cave burials that have been mentioned that date from around 800 AD to as far as back as 6000 BC. Peyote samples come from Shumla caves along the Pecos River in West Texas, and they date to around 5000 BC. And interestingly, this peyote that was found in Shumla cave has been in the Whitty collection for many years, and it was always thought of as completely made up of peyote. But recently, Martin Terry, a colleague of Trout's, did some investigations and found that it's made with various kinds of materials in addition to peyote, and it's made into the effigy of a peyote. So it brings people to wonder, gee, that's curious. What's that all about? To me, it seems to indicate that there was some kind of adoration or fetishes that were made in honor of the peyote as well. Some of the rock art in the cave shelters from north of Eagle Pass, Texas, have intentional renderings that an art historian, archaeologist named Carolyn Boyd has done extensive work on this, and seems to think that some of the representations that you see in this rock art are shamanistic, and that peyote is also involved. This rock art is just incredible. I encourage, if any of you are ever able to go down to the Lower Pecos River area, it is just amazing. And Carolyn has been very generous in taking Jim and I to many of these sites as well. And I also wanted to bring up that Trout, who will be talking after me, has done extensive work in the area, and he and Martin Terry have been doing a lot of analysis of peyote populations and trying to sort out the whole picture of peyote and variations, etc. You'll talk about that. From records that we know beyond the archaeological record, that this area is generically known as Coahuiltecans. It's a lot of desert-dwelling bands of extended family who would wander through the desert, and they were hunters and gatherers. And that we know that they existed as early as 11,000 years ago, and that we know also that the earliest documentation of them was by a Spanish explorer named Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of him. But in 1528 to 1536, he had come on a boat with some other Spaniards that were stranded in Florida. They came over on a makeshift boat to what became Texas, and they wandered lost in this terrain for 8 years. And they had to evade cannibalistic indigenous people as well as more friendly ones. And Cabeza de Vaca was an amazing man in and of himself in that he learned from shamans how to be a healer. So it got to the point where he was celebrated whenever he showed up in a village or a community and was treated very well. And he documented about their use of peyote as well as some of the early Spanish explorers. So they talk about how it was used with healing for their ceremonies, and one missionary had talked about that peyote is also used for war dances before they go to war, which I find very hard to believe, because you're not going to want to go wage war after you've been on peyote. And then with the Wijarika, that's the term that the Huichols call themselves. The earliest person to document them was a Norwegian explorer / anthropologist named Carl Lumholtz in the end of the 1800s, around the 1890s. He never did go on a peyote pilgrimage, but he did collect information about it. And when he first arrived, and this is actually from the community that Jim and I go to, San Andres Cuamiata, that he actually came across these guys, and they are peyoteros. You can tell because of the feathers they're wearing in their hats and some of the paraphernalia that they have. This is more recent. This was the shaman who was leading the pilgrimage for the San Jose temple that I was on. And so the traditions continue on today. They're very strong, and they're very much an integral part of Huichol culture, even as we are in the 21st century. So this is what Wirikuta looks like. Jim and I have gone, like I said, various times with Huichols. It's interesting that depending upon what community you are coming from, they have different places in Wirikuta where they go, and they have their sacred places, and they harvest the peyote. This up above is a sacred inactive volcano called Rau'unaji, and it is It's very much in danger because there is a Canadian mining company called Silver Majestic that has signed a concession with the Mexican government to mine this area. Up above is also Real de Catorce, which was an old colonial mining town. So Silver Majestic wants to open the mine again. And even though it's this far up here, and it will be destroying the sacred mountain that Huichols go to, the furthest east point on their pilgrimage, and it also, with the kinds of mining and dredging that you need to do, will releasing a lot of toxic materials that will eventually get down into Wirikuta. The United States, the Native American Church, they have a much more recent history of using peyote. It is a syncretistic religion that combines pan-Native American beliefs, mainly Plains Indians, it seems to me, along with Christianity. And it all came about when the Indians in the United States were getting rounded up and put in reservations, and the large area that we know now as Oklahoma was also called Indian Territory before it became a state. And that's where a lot of these indigenous people that were the most resistant ended up, and they came in contact with other indigenous groups that knew about peyote, and then this religion began to flourish and spread. It was the missionaries as well as the U.S. government had at that time tried to completely obliterate it, and they have not been successful to this day. It was incorporated in 1918 as a bona fide religion recognized by the federal government, and members of the Native American Church are legally able to use peyote in their ritual ceremonies. And we saw this slide earlier also. And so the first pioneer in the Western world trying to understand about peyote, and this seems to be what launched his career as well, was Richard Evans Schultes, so that in the 30s, he went with Weston LaBarre to a Plains Indian ceremony, Kiowa. I really like this picture of the two of them on either side of the roadman. The roadman is essentially like the shaman or the priest who runs the meetings. And so because of his work, at least Weston LaBarre wrote a very classic book that that is known to this day. It's the peyote cult. And then Schultes wrote a very seminal paper called The Appeal of Peyote. And he was actually looking at the medicinal aspects of peyote and how it might be used for treating various kinds of conditions. And some of them that it effectively tend to have reported to treat are arthritis, congestion, headaches, knee pain, fatigue, and is a tonic for good health. It's also been reported that in the early days of the Texas Rangers also used it if they didn't have alcohol around to have a good time. And then the Native American church members still continue to practice their religion. They go down to South Texas. This is Amada Cardenas. She is, I mentioned before, the first federally licensed peyote dealer, and she opens her door to anybody who shows up and welcomes them. And so it is a kind of a homeland and the peyote gardens for the Native American church where people can have their meetings. She has since passed away, but her son is still keeping it open for people to come and have their meetings. So I really like this quote by one roadman named Bobby Pedro, and he says, "It's where to come get peyote. They call it the garden because it's where magic grows, but it don't look like no garden. All thorns, stickers, and everything. Maybe that's the way it's supposed to be. You know, a lot of times I'd go out there and take a smoke, and that's tobacco, sacred tobacco, and pray, and find this peyote. Be just in the garden feeling like a good blessing. Make it down here for a certain reason. Somebody's sick or something like that. Take this medicine home. Have meetings for them." So all of the experiences that I had, I decided I really needed to write Amada's story. And so this is my most recent book, Amada's Blessings from the Peyote Gardens of South Texas. And along the medicinal lines and the healing properties of the peyote, it's helped a lot of individuals recover from alcohol and other drug addictions. It's used as a religious sacrament that helps individuals recognize and resolve their personal problems. And you shouldn't overlook the fact that it is a powerful experiences that occur from the ingestion of peyote that may lead to greater spiritual awareness and meaning in one's life. From the numerous medical studies that have been done, virtually all of them say that peyote is not addicting, that it has beneficial qualities, and that it helps in rehabilitation of alcohol and drug abuse. Huichols also use peyote in medicinal ways too, and it looks to me that there is very good evidence from scientific studies that have been done that show that it has antibiotic qualities that is good for treating certain kinds of bacteria that's resistant to penicillin. I can really vouch for this. Every time I go to the Huichols, I get stomach problems, dysentery, etc. And when I start eating peyote, it goes away completely. So I can attest to that myself. And a more recent study from 2003 shows that peyote may have the potential to increase immune response to cancerous tumors. This is a study that was done out of Nuevo León, Mexico, and I hope that there'll be follow-up on it because I think that's really fascinating that they found this. So this is the book that Peter First and I had edited and contributed to, People of the Peyote. And in here is where I talk about peyote and the everything that I knew at that point about peyote. This is a book that came after that, in which I started to really focus on my research with women. And I found out that almost all of the women who were my main consultants and who knew a tremendous amount and were master weavers were also shamans. So I had a chance to learn from the women's perspective about many things, including peyote. So first off, there are at least 60 alkaloids in peyote, and of course mescaline is one that's responsible for the psychoactive effects. We know that it was first synthesized by Arthur Hefter, in his groundbreaking work, and that this was in 1897. This is a picture from his laboratory. I really want to give thanks to the archival librarian Stephanie Schmitz for helping me locate this image and the next one that follows. And these were given to the Purdue Library Archives by Dave Nichols, and they're part of his papers that are at the Purdue Library. So they have this one. I love this one. I think this is when he's the rector of the University of Berlin. And I love his wild outfit there. So please bear with me, especially those of you who know this stuff way better than I do. This is kind of like helping me trying to understand how this all works, but entheogens in the brain. In order for the brain cells, they're called neurons, which function to transmit and analyze sensory information from the outside world. Neurons communicate information with one another. In order for the information received from the outside world to get to other neurons in the brain, one cell communicates with another through the synapse. This is a picture of the synapse as well. And they are, within the synapse are chemicals called neurotransmitters. And when the synapse becomes active, neurotransmitters are released and travel to molecules called receptor sites. We've heard a lot about that. And then I really like this illustration because it shows this is the sending neuron, this is the receiving neuron, here's the synapse. And here's a close-up, although talking to Dave Nichols this morning, he's saying, you know, they're really not that big. That in all these illustrations, they make them look a lot bigger than they are. And it was really fascinating, the slide that he showed yesterday, that they don't really look like this, but they're a lot more complex and they have more to them than this particular illustration has, but showing that the neurotransmitters are stimulate and then they are received at the other end. So this is actually a slide of rat serotonin. And so we know that psychedelic substances are chemically similar to naturally occurring chemical neurotransmitters in the brain. And as we've talked about, others have, mescaline interacts with the serotonin system, which involves sleep, mood, appetite, and possibly depression. Interesting also that mescaline closely resembles the neurotransmitters norepinephrine and dopamine. Norepinephrine affects emotions, engendering feeling states such as love and hate, joy and sadness. Dopamine pathways are related to reward-motivated behavior, hormonal release, and motor control. So I find it really interesting, and this is from the idea that Hoover put forth about the phosphines that occur when you have ingested a psychedelic such as mescaline, and that they are related to the discharge of neurons in the eye, and that anybody can have these same kind of designs, at least the first level of them, which are these geometric types of designs that go and they're moving and they're constantly changing. And Weijels actually duplicate these the women do in their embroidery. And it's considered a gift from the gods, and if they don't duplicate them and share them with everybody visually in the form of these bags, then the gods could get angry with them. They could make them sick, they could die, a family member that could happen to as well. So it's built into the whole experience that afterwards that women will duplicate the phosphine designs that they have experienced while under peyote. And so if you have enough peyote, you might go to the next stage, in which you go through this tunnel and there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and I think this is so beautifully portrayed by Mariano Valadez, a Weijel yarn painter. And after that, you will be in a different state, which is more like lucid dreaming. You interact with people and animals, and it is as if you are in a reality that is much more familiar to you in your waking state, but you are in another place. And this is where Huichols strive to reach, because that enables them to speak one-on-one with the gods. So there are different kinds of peyote that Huichols recognize. And when Jim and I have been to the desert with some shamans, they have pointed out, oh, this is the blue peyote, this is the green peyote, this is the yellow, this is the white, or this is the red. And Jim, as a botanist, at this point, can't really determine, what real differences there are. However, Jim was driving once when we went on a pilgrimage, and so they gave him one of the weaker kind, and they gave me two of the stronger kind. And yeah, there is a difference. Jim, I don't think you felt as much, but you were a good driver. So they have this incredible knowledge of peyote, but also of which ones should go to certain individuals on the pilgrimage. They give them lots of advice. They help them select the peyote. And even family members will, as they're harvesting peyote, select specific ones that they're going to take home to give to members of their family. Another thing that I think is really important is that they take the peyote back and use it for as long as it lasts. And then they have to go again to get more because it doesn't grow well where they live. There are plants that they also use with peyote. Nicotiana rustica is the sacred peyote, tobacco, very, very strong in nicotine content, that they will smoke when they are on the pilgrimage and when they're going to consume peyote. And it really helps you have a very focused perspective, and because of all the types of rituals that they do within the peyote ceremony, it's a good way to come back together, to regroup, to be able to complete the ceremonies and the rituals involved. And the single most important object that goes on the pilgrimage is this first hunted deer. That's its face, and it has this tobacco pouch on it that has the first cuttings of this tobacco, they call it makutse, and it's the first thing that has to go on the pilgrimage, leading them and in returning. They also consume other plants with peyote. One of them is a barrel cactus that they call majakwaji. And when I've been on the pilgrimage, the shaman will cut with his machete into this really gnarly cactus. He will take all the thorns and the skin off, slice it into little pieces, and with peyote that has already been collected, they'll kind of section it out like an orange. And he'll put some of the section sandwiched in between this barrel cactus, and then everyone eats that first as a kind of a sacrament. We have heard that Ariocarpus retusus is also eaten with peyote. Still need to gather more information about that. And I think what's really exciting is this uja. Jim and his colleague Gil Voss are the ones that identified this particular plant and the root, which they use to make the face painting. And they use the face painting to present themselves to the gods so that gods will recognize them better. Some of this face painting is beautiful and quite elaborate. And one shaman who I talked to about what it is like when you eat uja while you are also eating peyote, he says, the uja, this you feel with the peyote, you feel more, but it is different. It's not like smoking makutse does, sacred tobacco. It does not lower the strength like with makutse. When you combine uja and peyote, it is as if they elevate you. They raise you up. Zoom! That's how I felt. I saw the whole world very small, very round. I was moving as if I were the sun. That's the way I saw everything. I saw the gods, where they come from, and where they reside. I saw everything. That's what happened to me when I ate uja with peyote. So when I was working on my weaving, actually, I learned a myth about the origin of the path to Wirikuta. Oops. And that is that in the beginning, there were these two goddesses, Utunaka and Wiliubi, and a third one, and that through weaving on the loom, the path to Wirikuta manifested, and they took it. And before they were able to go in, they were accompanied by another being who I believe is probably Kayumari, the sacred deer god. And when they got into Wirikuta, that they ate peyote and they became pregnant. And so a Huichol shamanist did this drawing for me. So if you can see, they have little feti here. And so one of them then afterwards went back to the community, Utuanaka, and she was the one who introduced everybody to peyote and how to get there. And the other one became Wili Uwi, who is the goddess of peyote, and she remains in Wirikuta to this day. And this one I will mention a little bit later. So that got me thinking, because when I've been on the pilgrimage, I've seen women eating peyote at various stages of their pregnancy. And I was pretty surprised. And so I wanted to do some research onto, well, what might be going on? And believe it or not, in the 70s, there was research, laboratory research, done with mescaline. This is at a time when there were concerns about all the dangers of psychedelics and claiming that there was chromosomal damage if you took LSD. So in laboratory situations, I found 4 studies. Mescaline was also included with experiments on pregnant rats, mice, hamsters, and monkeys that were injected with varying doses of mescaline and then sacrificed to examine the results. So they found that the mescaline does cross the placental barrier, and once the mescaline entered the fetus, the movement to the central nervous system did not seem to be restricted. Brain tissue of the fetus rapidly accumulated mescaline in high concentrations, possibly due to the partially developed blood-brain barrier in the fetus. And also, when I saw this, I thought, well, that's really quite interesting. I don't think they're doing this if it's something that's maladaptive. So not all women will consume peyote when they are pregnant, but many of them do. And some do it after their first trimester because they say miscarriages, according to some, might happen. And yet other Huichol women claim that they go to a shaman, he will purify them and their baby, and nothing will happen bad to them, and they can eat as much peyote as they want throughout their whole pregnancy. So it makes me also wonder, well, what's happening to the fetus that's inside if we know that it is getting mescaline? I also wonder what is happening in the cognitive development of the fetus. So from 3 months onward, we know that the primary sensory areas in the neocortex of a fetus's brain begin to develop. The first area is tactile, then visual, followed by the auditory center. By 24 weeks, many of the neurons in the brain are present. The eyes are sensitive to light, and the fetus reacts to sound in the 3rd trimester. There is also rapid brain development in the 3rd trimester, which causes sensory and behavioral capacities to expand. So what is happening if they're getting mescaline while their cognitive development is occurring? A lot more is known about the cognitive development of infants and newborns. And so I think that you could try to, you can look at the second, probably the 3rd trimester of a fetus to get a good idea of what could be happening. So you can only imagine the kinds of sensory stimuli a fetus experiences from the peyote. And if hearing becomes more acute, can you imagine what the sounds within the womb with a mother's heart beating would sound like, and how that might affect as the neural pathways are developing? Only thing I have to compare with is going into the teepee for peyote meetings and the water drum, and it's just vibrating through you, and the sound of it. And so, what's going on? Researchers also theorize that internal or external stimulation of the neocortex of the fetus may help with the connection of neurons to the brain. It's been theorized that the reason newborns sleep so much, and that 50% of newborn sleep time is REM sleep, is because REM provides stimulation necessary for central nervous system development in young infants. Some professionals believe that REM sleep provides stimulation that the infant doesn't get from the environment because it spends little time in an alert state. So the earlier the stimulation, in other words, the better the child's central nervous system will develop, including cognitive abilities, reflex abilities, musical abilities, etc. And peyote, consumed by the mother, appears to be stimulating the baby inside. One of my main consultants, who's a shaman, also explained it. She was pregnant with various of her children eating peyote. And she wrote, in Wirikuta, I thought we would eat a lot of peyote to see what we could encounter, to learn more about our customs. So I ate 8 large peyote, and the peyote was strong. I got dizzy and then empeyotado, which means drunk with the peyote. I never thought that I was pregnant, so it was very early on. Kayumari, the deer person, appeared like a person and told me how I was feeling. He was talking to me from his heart. I think that Kayumari was talking to my baby. I didn't think the baby would be a boy. Afterwards, the shaman said he was given to me in Wirikuta by the gods, with our goddess Wili Uvi, the mother of peyote, so that our customs will not be lost. That is why he was born, why they gave him to me in Wirikuta, with me eating peyote. That's why he is peyote. I think he is peyote. He likes to eat peyote a lot. That's how some are born. So you have to think about these things. And I look to Stanislaw Grof. I know that some people may not agree with everything that he says and does, but I find his perinatal experiences idea very interesting in how they can transcend biology and have important psychological, philosophical, and spiritual dimensions. So if memories from the womb are part of a human being's unconscious, it's interesting to contemplate how peyote-related perinatal experience could influence cognitive development and enable individuals to access dimensions of human consciousness generally uncharted in Western culture. So even after a child is born, it will get peyote through the mother's milk, and it is encouraged to eat peyote, but never forced. And some kids really have an affinity to peyote. And going on one pilgrimage, there's this little 2-year-old girl, and we had, her parents had a pile of peyote that they'd harvested, and she kept going back and taking one and eating it, and taking another one and eating it. She started dancing around, and they thought it was great. They thought this is a sign that she was going to become a shaman. And like I say, I don't think they'd be doing this if there was maladaptive. In fact, I wonder how this might even predispose children to being shamans, where they literally and figuratively see the world very, very different than we could ever imagine. So I want to go back, though, to this myth of the pilgrimage to Wirikuta, and I know that I have about 10 minutes, that another part to this myth, which I find really interesting too, is that before these goddesses could enter into Wirikuta, this Kayumari, I'll call him, had to check to see if they were menstruating. And there is a place on the pilgrimage that we've gone to that most rituals don't go anymore because it's really off the beaten path of the roads. And it's called Hana Makaja. And this is where they say the water turned red from the menstruation of these goddesses. And when we went, the water wasn't red, but the soils around there are a very rich red color. And we have been told by Weechels, yes, at certain times of the year, it does turn red. So whether by rains or if some kinds of rivers can enter into there with a lot of silt, well then yes, it would look very red. So the idea about these menstruating women, they had to be fertile to be able to enter Wirikuta. And this goddess, who I can't quite remember her name, was not fertile. If you see, there's not a nice little fetus in there. And so she was barren like sand, and she went to become a mountain at the entrance to Wirikuta. So, okay, menstruation. Well, I've worked with, like I said, a lot of shamans. This is the main shamanist that I've worked with, Maria Paulita, and she's gone on the pilgrimage with us too. And inevitably, when I go on the pilgrimage and I get into Wirikuta, during my reproductive years, I get my period. And they do have rituals. They ritually cut your hair, they purify you, and then it's okay. You can have your medicine. But even up when they have their peyote ceremonies, women are not allowed to grind the peyote if they're menstruating, and other kinds of taboos as well. So there is this connection with menstruation. Then, in the Native American church, in the peyote meetings, it's taboo for women to go into the meeting if they're menstruating. I've always been really respectful of that, and many times when I've gone into the teepee, sometime during the night or the early morning, I'll get my period. And I know by talking to other women, indigenous women too, who are in the meeting, that they'll get their period also. So, wow, what is going on here with this whole idea of menstruation and peyote and these kinds of taboos? So I don't have a lot of good answers for this, but I have a lot of good questions and some clues. And I'm very curious for those of you who have some knowledge or some ideas about this to talk with you about it. For example, I have talked to a woman who is a specialist in reproductive endocrinology. Her name is Dr. Erica Wang, and she's at Cedars-Sinai in LA. She knows nothing about peyote, knows nothing about mescaline. I explained all this to her, and she said if she had to guess, and I know a lot of scientists don't like to guess, but if she had to guess, she would say peyote is stimulating the release of progesterone. I also talked to a nurse practitioner and advanced practice midwife, Maria Victoria Mangini, and she said, well, what comes to mind to me is Russell Marker, and he's a chemist who discovered near Orizaba, Veracruz, Mexico, a wild yam used by the local people, Dioscorea, and that he demonstrated that the compound could be synthesized into progesterone. And progesterone was used to treat menstrual disorders, problem pregnancies, and gynecological cancers. And she also emphasized that it's really important to take the native point of view. Their folk medicine, there is a lot to it. And even though they might be speaking in symbols or metaphors or myths, they know, and you, as the anthropologist, has to try to decode this so that we understand it in Western terms. Juanita Nelson, who's also a certified professional midwife and director at the Community Midwives in Durango, Colorado, she's also been involved with many years with the Native American Church, and for quite a few years she was married to a well-known roadman. And she also concurs. She thinks that peyote alkaloids activate the release of progesterone hormones, and she can empirically validate that this does happen. She's seen it happen over and over again. If a woman is close to getting her period, she eats medicine and she will get her period. She said if someone is off cycle, she'll get her period. If someone is ovulating or just finished with her period, she will not bleed. So she would know, being a midwife and being so involved with the Native American Church for over 20 years. So, okay, progesterone, the benefits of them. Progesterone is a natural female hormone. It's called the pregnancy hormone by some, and it's essential before and during pregnancy. All women who wish to become pregnant need progesterone to help the uterus prepare for and maintain a fertilized egg. Progesterone causes the uterine lining or endometrium to thicken, and this is what helps prepare a supportive environment in the uterus for a fertilized egg. And Juanita, the midwife, goes on to say that in her experience and observations at Native American Church meetings, that women who eat medicine or peyote have very little problems with miscarriages, that it helps establish the placenta and maturation of the fetus. But I must also admit, and I can't really speak for Native American Church members who are women, but for Huichol women, the traditional Huichol women, most of their reproductive life, they are either pregnant or nursing, so they don't get their period that much. So I find, I'm trying to put these pieces together as to how this all fits together. And also with the União do Vegetal, Charles Grob and even Dennis had brought to my attention about that members, females will consume ayahuasca, and that it serves as a way to manage a woman's pregnancy. I've also talked to Yatra de Silveira Barbosa. I don't know if anybody knows her. I met her various places, and she lives in Amsterdam, and she tells me that with a Santo Daime, if a member of her group is giving birth in a hospital, that they sneak in some ayahuasca that they give her as she's giving birth, and that with the newborn, without letting the medical professional know, they put a little drop of daime in the baby's mouth when it's born. And so, okay, again, more questions than answers I have, but these are practices that are being done. So just a little bit about the sexual hormones that they predominantly in the hypothalamus right here. And that the hypothalamus is the link between the endocrine and nervous system. The hypothalamus produces releasing and inhibiting hormones, which stop and start the production of other hormones throughout the body. So I got a book on neuroendocrinology, which I don't understand a lot of it, but this is the hypothalamus. I find it interesting. You've got the dopamine systems here, norepinephrine is here, serotonin in the red, and the circles that are in black are actually estrogen, and the ones in white are progesterone. So the fact that you have these so close together and that they are in many ways chemically related to each other, and then you throw in the mescaline from the peyote, there's bound to be these kinds of interactions. At least it appears through the 5-HT2A receptor. And I'd been in touch with Adam Halberstadt at UC San Diego. And so I told him about my experiences and what did he think. And so he said, well, getting my period every time, frequently when I'm eating peyote, and he says, such an effect isn't surprising. There are 5-HT2A receptors in the hypothalamus that regulate hormonal secretion. So the effects that you observed are likely occurring as a consequence of this action. This would be relatively easy to investigate, although it probably ultimately requires studies of animals to tease apart their underlying mechanisms. He's the one that David talked about with the twitch, the mouse twitch of the head. So other hormones that are part of this are also of interest. Both estrogen and serotonin receptors coexist in a variety of tissues. A premenopausal woman will have an abundance of estrogen and serotonin in circulation. So as aging occurs, serotonin levels decline, leading to a decline in serotonin receptors and potentially serotonin stores. So, how might the ingestion of peyote or mescaline influence the interplay between estrogen and serotonin in women of reproductive age and also women of postmenopausal age? This is a list of some of these other hormones that are in the hypothalamus, but I wanted to also point out the prolactin, the growth hormone, oxytocin in particular. So prolactin, there was a study in 1979 with the oral administration of mescaline, and it was found that it did stimulate the secretion of prolactin and growth hormone. And so there needs to be more research to be done as far as how the endocrine system is interacting with the serotonin system and with these types of psychedelics. As far as testosterone, that's really way out of my league, but I did talk to a researcher who is doing research with psilocybin to treat cluster headaches. And this person told me that one of their subjects or their patients with the treatment of psilocybin was relieved of their cluster headaches for weeks. And then this individual started taking testosterone and the cluster headaches came back. So again, all these questions of what really is going on. So I will conclude then by saying that we have a tremendous amount to learn from these indigenous peoples. It may not be so straightforward as we're used to in Western scientific terms, but if people are willing to put the time and the effort into trying, like I said, to untangle the symbols and the myths and translate them into something that we as Westerners can understand, there's a tremendous amount we can learn from these indigenous people. I do not, at this point, have concern that the Huichol people are dying off. Their population is growing. They are very strong, their language and other parts of their traditions, but they also are changing in other ways and adapting to the 21st century. And so, as far as the peyote goes, I think that might be even more endangered because of the terrible loss of habitat that's in South Texas that's being destroyed as we speak, and also in Wirikuta that there are a number of mestizos who are landless and they're ending up in the Wirikuta area. They're trying to grow corn crops and other types of food crops in order to survive. They also base a lot of their economy on tourism from outsiders, which is also wreaking havoc on the desert and the peyote populations. And I recently heard that there is, or there will be, planned some kind of radioactive dump in the area around Wirikuta as well. So I think there's so much more to learn, and I still think about peyote is everything. Without peyote, nothing would exist. And I think there is, I would like to leave it at that. So thank you.